The Grand Tribunal of the Zelvar Dominion hovered silently in orbit above the dead moon of Vaxari Prime. From the outside, the structure resembled an obsidian starfish, massive, symmetrical, and cold. Its jagged limbs extended outward, pulsing with a dull violet glow, a signal that the trial would soon commence. Billions across the galaxy tuned in, eager to witness the fate of the human captured during the failed rebellion on Tarsus III. His name was Captain Sam Navarro, and the Zelvar had chosen him not merely to die, but to serve as a warning. The trial chamber itself was vast and echoing, carved from the mineral bones of the moon and augmented with towering pillars of black glass that reached skyward like claws. Thousands of representatives from loyal Zelvar-controlled systems filled the concentric observation rings, each encased in individual stasis domes to preserve atmosphere and biological integrity. Species of all shapes and sizes waited in reverent silence, their attention fixed on the center platform, where the execution chair loomed like an ancient relic of violence. Captain Sam Navarro stood at the center, hands bound in magnetic cuffs, posture upright despite the energy field that pulsed faintly around his ankles and neck. He was tall for a human, with sun-darkened skin, a strong jaw shadowed by several days of unshaven stubble, and dark eyes that scanned the chamber with cold detachment. His military uniform had been stripped, replaced by a plain gray suit, the standard garb for Dominion prisoners, yet he carried himself with the pride of a soldier who had already accepted death. Across the platform, a procession of robed figures began to emerge. They moved in perfect unison, their purple robes swaying with each step, revealing glimpses of scaled, multi-jointed limbs beneath. At the head of the procession walked High Executor Varsho, the keeper of the toxin, a being revered as both a scientist and a priest. His angular insectoid features shimmered with flecks of iridescent oil, and the golden medallion of the Dominion pulsed against his chest, syncing with the heartbeat of the chamber itself. As Varsho reached the platform, the chamber dimmed. The lights retracted into the ceiling, revealing a globe of holographic fire suspended above the platform, a rotating model of Earth. A voice rang out in the universal tongue, cold and commanding. Let all witness the trial of Sam Navarro, emissary of the Terran Confederation, found guilty of rebellion, insubordination, and desecration of Zelvar sovereignty. His punishment shall be death by Aztec, the final toxin. A low murmur spread across the chamber. The Aztec toxin was a living chemical compound developed over centuries, engineered to infiltrate any cellular structure, paralyze neurological signals, and dissolve organic tissue from the inside out. Its potency was such that even Zelvar scientists handled it with spiritual reverence. In the 27 public executions it had been used for, not a single being had lasted more than 30 seconds. 2 guards stepped forward, dragging a crystal cylinder onto the platform. Inside it, the toxin glowed a sickly green, its consistency somewhere between liquid mercury and mist. The guards opened the chamber with ritualistic precision, and a tendril of vapor curled out like a beckoning finger. A ceremonial goblet, forged from obsidian and laced with gold, was brought forth. Varsho turned toward Sam, who had not flinched once. The High Executor spoke with the solemnity of a death priest. This poison does not discriminate. It knows no mercy. It has reduced Korlari warlords to puddles and made the Inzalas scream for their ancestors. And now, human, you will know its truth. Sam said nothing. He met the High Executor's gaze with unnerving calm, his eyes reflecting not fear, but something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or defiance. Varsho noticed, and for the first time in his long life, felt a twitch of unease ripple through his thorax. The goblet was filled slowly, the Aztec swirling as if aware of its purpose. The moment the final drop fell, the goblet was sealed with an invisible pressure field and handed to a ceremonial servant, who approached Sam with reverent caution. The human was released from his magnetic shackles, though 2 guards remained beside him, energy lances pointed directly at his heart. He reached for the goblet without hesitation, his movements fluid and calm. As his fingers wrapped around the obsidian stem, the entire chamber held its breath. This was the moment. The camera drone zoomed in, broadcasting every angle of his face, the glimmer of the goblet, the faint ripple of the liquid within. The crowd waited, some with anticipation, others with barely contained glee. Sam paused. He looked around the chamber, not with desperation, but with something resembling amusement. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lifted the goblet to his lips. At that precise moment, Executor Varsho leaned forward, expecting the instant recoil of agony, the shuddering, the convulsing, the melting of tissue that had defined every execution before this one. Yet, nothing happened. Sam took a sip, and then another, and then he emptied the entire contents of the goblet in one motion, tilting his head back until the last of the toxins slid down his throat. He exhaled, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and handed the goblet back to the stunned servant. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Even the ambient hum of the chamber's life support system seemed to falter. Varsho blinked, the inner membrane of his eyes twitching involuntarily. Sam smacked his lips. "Tastes like bad gin," he said, his voice smooth, his heartbeat maddeningly steady. Pandemonium erupted. Across the observation rings, alien dignitaries surged against their domes, shouting in disbelief. Some fainted, others screamed curses in their native tongues. Varsho staggered backward, clutching at his ceremonial medallion as if it had betrayed him. The two guards moved to restrain Sam again, but he didn't resist. He stood tall, breathing slowly, not a single tremor in his muscles. No foaming at the mouth, no neurological collapse, no signs of poisoning at all. The High Executor was frozen in place. Everything he had believed, everything the Dominion had projected to its enemies, was crumbling. The Ashtak was not invincible. Humanity had just proven it, not through weapons, not through warships, but through biology, through sheer, horrifying resilience. And Sam Navarro had done it with a smirk. Alarms began to pulse across the high balconies of the tribunal chamber as chaos unraveled the precise structure of the ceremony. Dignitaries scrambled within their protective domes, demanding emergency evacuations or explanations. The Ashtek was never meant to fail. It wasn't just a poison, it was a legacy. Its defeat wasn't a humiliation. It was an existential crisis. Yet, in the eye of the storm, Sam stood motionless. His wrists, now unbound, hung relaxed at his sides, and his expression remained unreadable. Around him, Dominion guards whispered frantically into their comms, relaying vitals and toxin dispersal data to the ship's core processors. Data hollows bloomed mid-air, revealing the impossible. Sam's neural functions were stable. His cardiac rhythm held steady. His temperature had not spiked. The toxin had vanished from his bloodstream before it could even interact with major organs. Somehow, his body had absorbed and dismantled it as if it were nothing more than a trace element of unfamiliar caffeine. High Executor Varsho was not one to panic. His training forbade it. But the sensation coiling in his upper spine was close. The crowd's rising unrest reached his auditory sensors, but he focused on the human, now idly pacing the platform as though he were taking a stroll in a garden. No visible symptoms, no desperation, no death, just Sam and the silence around him, deep and echoing. Then, without warning, Sam raised his hand and pointed to the nearest holocam drone. "I assume this is still live?" he asked. His voice was calm but loud enough to carry. It was. The broadcast hadn't been cut. Billions across the galaxy were watching, and Varsho knew this spectacle had taken a dangerous turn. The tribunal was meant to display superiority. Now it had become a stage for defiance. "You want to explain this, Varsho?" Sam continued. "Or should I?" The High Executor's limbs twitched. "Silence," he snapped, though the word rang hollow. "You do not command this floor." Sam shrugged. "No, I don't. But your poison failed, and now the entire galaxy is wondering what else will." The blow landed harder than Varsho anticipated. Murmurs turned to shouts in some corners of the chamber. Several representatives began disconnecting their domes from the central system, issuing withdrawal commands. Others, particularly those who had rebelled in secret before, now took notes with hungry precision. Something was shifting. The authority of the Dominion was no longer monolithic. It was cracking, one fracture at a time. Two more guards stepped forward, clearly receiving new instructions from command. They approached Sam with aggressive posture, but he simply raised his hands, palms outward. "I'm not here to fight," he said, his tone measured. "You made your point. You wanted to show what happens when someone challenges you. Now the galaxy saw what happens when someone doesn't die. The guards hesitated, then stood down, awaiting further orders. Even protocol seemed uncertain now. Varsho turned away from the platform and activated a private communication channel with the Dominion's High Council. A ring of pale blue light formed in his palm as the Council's avatars materialized above it. Chancellor Ultek, a being composed of living crystal strands, flickered with static anxiety. "You assured us the Aztec would kill the human," he hissed. "You've embarrassed us before the stars." Varsho tried to keep his tone level. "This is unexpected, but not final. He is one man, yet one man drinks our final weapon and walks away unscathed," Ultek growled. "If we cannot even execute a Terran emissary, what message do we send to the frontier colonies still loyal to us?" "We adapt," Varsho said. "We examine his physiology, understand the failure, and rebuild." "Do so quickly," the Chancellor warned, "before our enemies see this as permission to rise." The holograms vanished. Varsho turned, expression hardened, and issued a command. "Take him to Isolation Chamber 7, he said. "Do not sedate him, do not interrogate him. Not yet." The guards moved again, and this time Sam offered no resistance. He walked between them with the air of someone who knew this wasn't over, that the real game had only just begun. The walk through the tribunal corridors was long and sterile. Polished stone gave way to metallic mesh, and the hallways narrowed as they reached the lower decks of the tribunal's core. The air changed, cleaner, artificial, and colder. At last they arrived. Chamber 7 was not a prison cell. It was a research pod, an analysis vault designed for studying biohazards, alien anatomy, or anomalies that couldn't be explained by science alone. The transparent walls were layered with molecular shields, and the ceiling was lined with scanners built to penetrate everything short of neutron shielding. Sam stepped inside without hesitation, as the door hissed shut behind him. He sat on the medical platform at the center and looked around. "Well," he muttered to himself, "now this feels familiar." Overhead, surveillance systems powered up. Varsho stood behind a thick partition, flanked by 3 Dominion scientists, 2 Zelvar, one of the insectoid caste, and another from a subordinate species known for microscopic analysis. Data streams began flowing immediately. "We'll begin full-spectrum scanning," one scientist said. "Neural, biochemical, immune response." Varsho gave a single nod. "Start with the blood work. Identify the compound responsible." Sam remained still, allowing the beams to wash over him. He was used to this, probably more used to it than any of them expected. Interrogations, experiments, isolation. This wasn't new. What was new was being the man who had just shattered a cultural weapon in front of half the galaxy. He knew what the Exilvar would be looking for. He even had theories himself. But what he didn't know, and what made him most curious, was what they'd do when they discovered the truth. That Earth, his home, was a death world by galactic classification. That humanity's bodies had evolved under constant threat from microbes, from toxins, from planetary instability, and had developed layered systems of defense that no clean-grown species could replicate. The Aztec wasn't a miracle. It was a weapon designed by creatures who had never known what it meant to survive their own planet. Sam did. Every human did. His blood carried generations of brutal environmental adaptation. The Zelvar's poison wasn't useless because it was weak. It was useless because it had never been tested on a species forged by chaos. An alert sounded in the analysis chamber. "Reading inconsistent enzymatic collapse," one of the scientists muttered. "Auto-nenalization occurring faster than our systems can record it." "Explain," Varsho snapped. "His body didn't fight the toxin. It unmade it. On contact. Not even immune resistance. The toxin doesn't exist in his bloodstream anymore." Varsho stared at the screen, the implications crashing through him like falling debris. He had seen biochemical resistance before. Certain species could suppress specific compounds, delay death, even adapt if exposed in low quantities. But he had never seen a complete molecular erasure. The Aztec had been destroyed not by antibodies, but by something even more primal. "Run a comparative analysis," Varsho ordered, "against known Earthborn compounds. I want to know what this creature has consumed that made this possible." "Yes, Executor." The chamber lights dimmed as new scans began, more invasive than before, and still Sam sat in silence, arms folded across his chest, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He wasn't in a cell anymore. He was in a laboratory. And in laboratories, knowledge was power. He planned to give them exactly what they wanted, just not in the way they expected. The scanners fell silent, leaving only the low hum of circulating air in the analysis vault. Sam shifted slightly on the cold slab beneath him, glancing up at the ceiling where the surveillance lenses pulsed with pale blue light. He could tell they were recalibrating. The way the beams had intensified in the last minute meant the Zelvar scientists were confused, frustrated, or both. He liked that. Behind the walls, separated by reinforced crystal and invisible shielding, Varsho stood with his claws pressed tightly behind his back. The High Executor's mind was a storm of calculations. The data pouring in from the scans made no sense by Dominion standards. No species, no matter how evolutionarily advanced, should have been capable of neutralizing the Aztec with such surgical precision. Yet the human had done it not just efficiently, but unconsciously. That terrified him more than he was willing to admit. The assistant scientist, a short, glass-skinned female of the Hegral caste, pulled back from the data table. Her voice buzzed through her mask, hesitant. Executor, we found something. Varsho didn't move, but the angle of his head sharpened. It's not a defense mechanism, she said. It's not an immune response. He didn't fight the poison, he processed it, like it was food. The enzymes in his digestive tract broke it down on entry. The molecular degradation is nearly identical to what we observe when Terrans consume ethyl compounds, what they call alcohol. The lead scientist, who had remained silent during the scans, stepped forward. He was an older Zelvar, his mandibles stained with the gray discoloration of decades spent around volatile reagents. She is correct, he said slowly. The Aztec binds to specific neural transmitters, but in his system those pathways have shielding. Biological shielding. Varsho finally turned. Shielding, built into his physiology. Yes, multiple redundancies, layers of them. The neural sheaths are unusually thick. We believe it is a result of Earth's hostile ecosystem. Atmospheric instability, toxins in food, microbial saturation. The human body evolved to filter and resist constant environmental threats. And what of the enzyme that destroyed the toxin? Varsho asked. It appears to be native to his gut flora, a symbiotic organism. We are running a gene scan now, the Hegral scientist interjected. Executor, if I may, this could be a biological weapon, engineered, not evolved. Verju glanced sharply in her direction. Are you suggesting the Terrans created this? I am suggesting they might have found a way to weaponize adaptation. The idea took root in Varsho's mind like a splinter. A biological process that not only protected its host but could devour enemy weapons? It would change the dynamics of war forever. The Dominion's most prized advantage, fear, would become obsolete if enemies could simply survive their most sacred tool of punishment. Inside the vault, Sam leaned his head back, his voice echoing lazily through the chamber. Are we doing more scans? Or is someone going to bring me lunch? Varsho ignored the comment. He opened a direct communication channel into the vault and activated his translator. His voice came through the speaker with its usual reverberation. Captain Navarro, your resilience defies the logic of our science. Would you be willing to explain the origin of your immunity? Sam opened one eye, grinned faintly, and replied without standing. I'm not immune. You just don't know how humans work. You consumed a weapon that kills on contact. Explain how. Ever hear of blowfish? Caffeine? Snake venom? We consume that stuff for fun. Your poison's not scary, it's just spicy. Varsho felt a fresh spike of frustration but buried it beneath layers of discipline. You will cooperate or suffer consequences. Sam finally sat up. Suffer? You tried to kill me, remember? What else could you possibly do that I haven't trained for? Interrogation, dissection, experimentation. Your anatomy will yield answers one way or another. Sam narrowed his eyes slightly. You can try, but you better hope your labs are stronger than your poisons. Varsho severed the channel. The conversation had yielded no useful intelligence, but it confirmed one thing. The human wasn't afraid. Not of pain, not of death. That made him unpredictable, dangerous. The scientists resumed their work in silence. Within minutes, a new analysis came through. Executor, said the older Zelvar, his voice tight. We have identified the symbiotic organism in his gut. Varsho turned toward the screen. It is bacterial, the scientist continued, but it is not artificial. This strain evolved in the Terran biosphere, naturally. in high-gravity environments, extreme temperatures, heavy metal contamination zones. It is not unique to him. In fact, records from previous prisoners suggest it is common among Terrans. Then this ability is not his alone? No, Executor, it is human. The weight of those words settled over the chamber like a thundercloud. If the entire species carried this adaptability, if each of them could resist, process, or even consume toxins at this scale, it meant humanity was not merely difficult to kill. It meant they were designed to endure the impossible. Varsho felt a chill ripple through his exoskeleton. "Send this data to Central Command," he ordered, "and begin preparations for an extended containment. I want no accidents, no exposure, no further assumptions." The chamber emptied soon after, but Varsho remained, watching the human through the glass as Sam lay back again, arms behind his head, clearly comfortable in his strange confinement. The human was not a prisoner. He was a catalyst, and somewhere, deep in the back of Varsho's mind, a darker thought took root. What if this man wasn't the exception? What if he was the first warning? The cold hum of the isolation vault settled into a monotony that would have driven most prisoners to madness within hours. The artificial lighting dimmed periodically, mimicking a circadian cycle that no human would ever find natural, but Sam remained unaffected. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, his eyes half closed, as though he were simply resting between meetings. The bench beneath him was metallic and sterile, designed to discourage comfort, but he adjusted with the ease of someone long accustomed to making peace with discomfort. Behind layers of reinforced alloy and transparent shielding, Executor Varsho paced in slow, precise steps. His usual composure was fraying beneath the pressure of uncertainty. He was a creature of structure, logic, and calculation. His rise within the Dominion had been marked by strategic brilliance, a reputation for eliminating anomalies before they could become threats. But the man in the vault was not just an anomaly. He was a breach in the very foundation of the Dominion's authority. The scientists continued to analyze data, but their work had begun to slow. Every new discovery pointed in the same direction. Nothing about Sam's physiology was artificial, and yet everything about it was a threat. What the Dominion had once labeled primitive biology had become a quiet force of terror. Varsho turned to the intercom, opened a direct line to the containment officer stationed outside the vault, and spoke with low authority. "Increase atmospheric pressure by 15%. Begin thermal stress test." The order was carried out immediately. A faint hiss echoed through the chamber, and Sam noticed the shift within seconds. The air thickened subtly, and the temperature began to climb. He rolled his neck, cracked his knuckles, and exhaled slowly. Then, without complaint, he stood and began stretching. Not in reaction to stress, simply out of routine. From the observation deck, Varsho narrowed his eyes. "Let's see how long your composure lasts." The temperature rose further. Sweat began to form on Sam's brow, but his movements remained fluid. He removed the upper half of the sterile jumpsuit, tying the sleeves around his waist. Muscles tensed and gleamed under the artificial lighting. Scars decorated his torso, some thin and long, others brutal and misshapen. They told a story of violence, hardship, and survival. Each one was a reminder that Sam had faced worse than anything Varsho could orchestrate in a sealed box. Minutes passed, then 20, then 40. Sam walked to the wall, placed both hands against it, and began doing slow, deliberate push-ups. The motion was rhythmic, disciplined, a man keeping himself busy. He was not enduring the test, he was ignoring it. Frustrated, Varsho turned from the display. "Cease thermal test. Begin chemical filtration. Introduce graded sedative mist. Let's see if his mind is as unshakable as his body." The room's ventilation shifted, this time with no visible sign. A gaseous compound, translucent and odorless, filtered into the air. It was a sedative known as Karzini, slow-acting, psychotropic in nature, capable of inducing fatigue, confusion, and memory loss. It had been used across the Dominion to pacify insurgents and break resistant prisoners. No subject had endured it longer than 90 minutes. Inside the vault, Sam paused his push-ups and sat against the bench, breathing deeply. His gaze flicked toward the ceiling, then toward the floor. His expression remained calm, but the muscles in his jaw twitched ever so slightly. He recognized something was wrong. The mist began to take effect. His eyes grew heavier and his limbs slowed. For the first time, he looked tired, not exhausted, but physically weighed down. Still, he refused to lie back. He remained seated, spine straight, head forward. An hour passed. Varsho watched with growing tension. "Still conscious?" "Yes, Executor," the technician answered. "No cognitive regression, no hallucination patterns. He is stable." Varsho clicked his lower mandibles in irritation. "Increase concentration to maximum threshold." Warnings flashed on the monitoring systems. Prolonged exposure at those levels could rupture the lungs of weaker species. The technician hesitated but obeyed. The air inside the chamber grew visibly denser, waves of distortion swimming near the floor. Sam grunted softly and stood again. His movements were slower now, as if submerged in water, but he kept moving. He walked in a tight circle, stretching his arms, inhaling deeply, as if he were forcing his body to respond by sheer will alone. His pupils dilated unnaturally, but he did not fall. Instead, he knelt near the floor, pressed his fingertips against the metal, and smiled faintly. "You're getting desperate," he whispered. His voice echoed through the chamber, unintentionally broadcast through the environmental feedback loop. Varsho froze. Sam looked up at one of the surveillance lenses, his expression bleary but defiant. "You think you're studying me, but I've been watching you too." Varsho's claws tensed. "Cut the mist. Now." The sedative feed shut off and decontamination began. As fresh oxygen surged into the room, Sam dropped to a sitting position, breathing hard. Sweat drenched his body, and tremors ran down his arms, but his heart was still beating in rhythm. His consciousness had held through conditions that would have dropped entire battalions. The High Executor stepped back from the glass. This man was not simply surviving. He was adapting, responding, calculating, and worst of all, learning. Later that cycle, Varsho met with an internal strategist, Commander Lithar, a tactical mind responsible for Dominion war doctrine. The two stood in a sealed chamber lit by cascading vertical beams, each pulse of light tied to classified security access. Lithar, smaller and darker in build, spoke first. "You're concerned." Varsho did not reply. "The Terran's resilience changes the equation," Lithar continued. "What once looked like isolated human defiance now appears structural, evolutionary. It's possible we've miscalculated their role in the galactic hierarchy. We must not allow perception to become weakness," Varsho snapped. "The Dominion has never been ruled by fear, but it has been destroyed by arrogance," Lithar replied. "If one human can neutralize our sacred toxin and withstand our enhanced containment, then we must assume that others can follow." "What would you suggest?" Varsho demanded. "Containment is no longer the objective," Lithar said. "You must break him. Publicly, no poisons, no science, only pain. Use force, use spectacle, show the galaxy he can fall. And if he does, then you have a martyr." Varsho remained silent for several moments, his inner organs contracting uneasily. He had executed hundreds of rebels over his career, destroyed fleets, crushed riots, vaporized resistance. But never had he been told that an execution might amplify the rebellion instead of suppressing it. At last he nodded. "Prepare the chamber. We will do this the old way." The arena beneath the tribunal core had not been used in over a century. It had been built in a different age, one when the Dominion's control was still questioned, and public punishments were a form of reassurance to its nervous citizens. Circular in design, the chamber's walls were embedded with ancient display panels, now flickering back to life, casting ghostly light on the polished black floor. In the center stood a single platform, raised by hydraulic columns and surrounded by retractable barriers laced with pulse energy. It was a place of spectacle, not science, a relic of blood and fear. High Executor Varsho stood atop the command bridge overlooking the arena, flanked by Commander Lithar and a line of elite guards. His posture was rigid, his mandibles unmoving. The events of the previous cycles had turned whispers of doubt into silent questions among the council. A human had survived their sacred toxin, endured their methods, and made a mockery of their dominion. Now all eyes were fixed on this final moment. The galaxy needed a display of dominance. Sam Navarro was led into the chamber by two guards. His wrists were cuffed, his shirt removed, his skin marked by faint bruises from the chemical tests and enforced containment. Yet he walked steadily. His eyes scanned the space with clinical awareness. He had fought in many places, abandoned colonies, corporate kill zones, collapsed stations on the edge of known space, but nothing like this. This was theater, and he knew when he was standing on a stage. The guards locked his wrists to magnetized cuffs embedded in the ground, forcing him to kneel. A low hum filled the air as the barriers around him activated, glowing blue with deadly restraint fields. Any attempt to escape would result in instant neurological shutdown. Above him, a massive holographic projection of his face hovered in the air for all viewers across the Dominion to see. Sam kept his chin high. Verschow stepped forward, his voice magnified by the arena's ancient systems. Let it be known to all systems and sovereign worlds. The Dominion suffers no defiance. Let none mistake tolerance for weakness. The creature before you is a symbol of chaos, a reminder of what primitive rebellion brings. Today, order is restored. From the far side of the chamber, a large door opened, revealing a figure draped in armor the color of dried blood. The champion, a Dominion executioner bred for punishment rituals, stepped forward with a two-pronged electrospear in hand. His stature was massive, twice Sam's width and nearly a head taller, his limbs reinforced with synthetic musculature and ceremonial implants. He had no name. He was known only as Carven, the final verdict. The crowd, watching from remote channels, grew silent. Sam met the executioner's gaze and smirked. I hope you've had your breakfast. Verschow gave the signal. The restraints disengaged and Carven surged forward with crushing momentum. Sam rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the first strike. Sparks exploded from the ground where the spear slammed into metal. He moved quickly, instinctively, slipping beneath the giant's swing and striking upward with a fist to the executioner's ribs. It was like punching a wall. The giant barely flinched. Sam ducked again, grabbed a broken shard of metal from the floor and twisted his body behind one of the arena's rising pillars for cover. The executioner moved methodically, pressing forward with unstoppable force. Each blow of the spear cracked the arena's ancient surface. But Sam wasn't aiming to match strength. He was waiting. After the fourth strike missed, Carven growled, frustrated. That moment of hesitation gave Sam just enough time. He slid across the floor, launched himself forward, and drove the jagged metal into the executioner's exposed leg joint. The beast roared and swung wildly, but Sam had already vaulted away. Blood oozed from the wound, dark and thick. Carven stumbled, and Sam knew he'd broken something vital. But the battle was far from over. The executioner's armor hissed, releasing a dose of regenerative mist into the wound. Carven raised his weapon again, this time not to intimidate, but to kill. The next strike landed. The spear grazed Sam's shoulder, sending volts of electricity through his body. He cried out, dropping to one knee, but his mind clamped down against the pain. Years of combat had taught him how to compartmentalize agony. He stood, bleeding and trembling, and shouted at the projection above. Is this the best you've got? Verschow's claws tightened on the command panel. Sam pushed forward once more, driving his body into Carven's midsection. He reached for the wound he had opened earlier and jammed his thumb deep into the torn tissue. The executioner screamed. The massive figure slammed a fist into Sam's back, sending him crashing into the wall. Bones cracked. Blood sprayed from his mouth. He got back up. The crowd watching across the stars didn't cheer. They didn't laugh. They watched, silent, transfixed, uncertain. Sam dragged himself forward, limping but smiling. Carven turned, stumbling. Blood loss was affecting his reflexes. The human advanced again. He didn't stop. He didn't retreat. With every step, his body screamed to give up, but his spirit refused. And then, at last, Carven fell to one knee. Sam moved in with the last of his strength. He seized the electrospear, tore it from the executioner's grip, and drove it down. Through armor, through bone, through final breath. Silence. Then the barriers deactivated. Sam stood over the body, bloodied and shaking. He turned slowly toward the high deck, his eyes locking with Verschow's. I told you, he said hoarsely. We're built different. Verschow could no longer speak. He stared in disbelief at the monitors, the fallen executioner, the standing human. News of the event spread like wildfire. Clips of Sam's defiance went viral across every inhabited system. Empires watched, rebellions bloomed, colonies whispered of the man who drank death, endured torture, and stood triumphant, in an arena not meant to be survived. Within days, 3 border systems declared independence from the Dominion. By the end of the month, 6 more had followed. The Dominion did not collapse overnight. But the myth of its invincibility had died the moment Sam Navarro remained standing. Fear, the weapon the Dominion had wielded for generations, no longer worked. Back on Earth, months later, Sam sat in a quiet cafe overlooking the rust-red hills of a former military outpost, now repurposed as a memorial. He wore a patched jacket, the collar turned up against the breeze. A child ran past him, laughing. Somewhere nearby, an old veteran nodded in silent recognition. His body still carried the scars, but his eyes were peaceful. When a reporter asked him later why he never gave in, Sam smiled. Because pain is temporary, he said, but fear is a choice, and once you take that away from tyrants, all that's left is noise. And with that, he finished his coffee and disappeared into the crowd, not as a symbol, not as a hero, but as a man who had once taken a sip of poison, and in doing so, gave an entire galaxy permission to fight back.